A man carried a boy through a flooding river in the middle of the night. The water had risen past his waist and was still climbing dark and fast, swirling with broken branches and loose soil torn from the hillside by a storm that had not stopped falling since sundown. The man moved slowly against the current, each step deliberate and heavy, his boots searching for solid ground beneath the rushing water, while the boy clung to his back with arms so thin they looked as though they might snap from the effort of holding on. Behind them, a woman followed several steps back, clutching something wrapped tightly in a soaked wool blanket against her chest. The shape inside the blanket was alive, trembling and bleeding through the fabric in a dark stain that spread slowly with each step she took. Her face was pale and focused, her jaw set against the cold, and she did not look down at the water pulling against her legs, because looking down would have meant acknowledging how close they all were to being swept away. Somewhere ahead, through the curtain of rain and the wild shaking of tree branches caught in the wind, a pair of headlights waited on a ridge road. The truck sat with its engine running and its doors open, and beside it, two small dogs stood side by side, at the edge of the gravel, their ears flattened, their bodies shaking, watching the forest below, as though they understood exactly what was happening in the dark. 12 hours earlier, the man carrying that boy did not know the child existed. He did not know the woman walking behind him. He did not know the wounded animal she held, or the two trembling dogs waiting by the truck, or the elderly grandmother who at that very moment sat alone in a farmhouse kitchen, praying for a phone call that might never come. All of it began with 3 sets of paw prints in the mud beneath a roadside oak tree and 2 German shepherd puppies shivering in the rain on a night when no living creature should have been left outside. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. The rain had been falling over Pine Hollow, Oregon since late afternoon. Not the kind that arrives loudly and leaves within the hour, but the slow gray winter rain that settles into the streets and rooftops and surrounding forest until the entire valley feels wrapped in damp silence, as though the sky itself has decided to exhale and simply forgotten to stop. Pine Hollow was the sort of small American town that people rarely remembered passing through. A place with one main street, a gas station that stayed open through the night for truckers hauling timber toward the coast, and rows of old wooden houses that leaned slightly under the weight of many winters spent standing in the rain. Beyond the last streetlight, the land gave way almost immediately to forest. Tall Douglas fir and red cedar rising dark and patient against the sky, their branches breathing slowly in the wind, while mist drifted in pale ribbons across the narrow county roads that wound between the hills. On nights like this, the town seemed to shrink into itself. Lights dimmed behind rain-streaked windows, traffic nearly gone, leaving only the quiet whisper of water falling through the trees and the occasional groan of an old building settling deeper into its foundation. Along one of those roads, a dark green Ford pickup truck moved steadily through the rain. Its headlights cut 2 pale tunnels through the mist, while the windshield wipers pushed water aside in slow rhythmic arcs that matched the breathing of the man behind the wheel. The heater pushed warm air across the dashboard, and the faint smell of wet pine drifted through the vents whenever the wind shifted direction outside. The man's name was Corbett Hale. He was approaching 40 years old, though the lines beside his eyes and the early threads of gray woven through his short ash-brown beard suggested a life that had aged him faster than the calendar alone could explain. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and compact athletic build shaped by years of military service. His posture remained naturally straight, even while sitting behind the wheel, as though discipline had become something his body simply refused to release, regardless of how many months had passed since he last wore a uniform. Corbett had served 12 years as a Navy SEAL, 12 years of missions in places whose names he was never permitted to say aloud, of nights spent crawling through landscapes that smelled of dust and diesel and burning metal, of learning to read silence the way other people read ordinary conversation. He had been good at it, dangerously good. The kind of operator who noticed the wrong shadow in a doorway 3 seconds before anyone else in the squad, the kind who could navigate a mountain ridge at night using nothing but the angle of the wind and the position of a single star above the clouds. But 2 years ago, Corbett had come home, and home had proven to be the one terrain he could not navigate. The cabin waiting for him at the edge of Pine Hollow was a modest, single-story structure built decades earlier by a logging family who had long since moved away. It sat alone among the tall cedars and firs, as though it had chosen solitude the same way Corbett eventually had. The porch sagged slightly at one corner. The wooden railing had been worn pale by years of Pacific rain, and a dim yellow bulb above the front door cast just enough light to see the mist drifting through the trees on quiet evenings. Inside the cabin reflected the personality of the man who lived there. Functional, sparse, carefully organized without unnecessary decoration. A heavy wooden table near the kitchen window. A worn leather armchair facing the fireplace. A small bookshelf that held a mixture of military manual survival field guides and a few dog training books Corbett had purchased years ago but never opened. On the top shelf, a framed photograph of 4 men in desert camouflage lay face down against the wood, its glass dusty, the image hidden from view, as though whoever had placed it there could not decide whether to keep it or throw it away, and had chosen instead to simply stop looking at it. Corbett did not sleep well in that cabin. The silence that filled the rooms at night was not the peaceful kind that comforts a tired mind. It was the heavy kind. The kind that presses against the walls and fills the space between thoughts until every small sound becomes something that needs to be identified and evaluated. A branch scraping the roof. A floorboard shifting with temperature. The distant bark of a coyote somewhere deep in the hills. Each sound pulled his attention toward it with the same automatic reflex he had once used to detect threats in hostile territory, and each time his attention returned to the empty room, the silence felt heavier than before. Driving helped. Driving gave him motion without destination noise, without meaning, and the steady rhythm of tires on wet pavement kept certain memories from rising too clearly to the surface of his mind. So on nights when the cabin walls began pressing inward and the silence grew too loud to ignore, Corbett would climb into the truck and drive through the rain along the forest roads outside Pine Hollow, letting the engine hum and the wipers sweep and the headlights push forward into a darkness that asked nothing of him except that he keep moving. That is what he was doing on this particular evening, driving without purpose through the storm, heading nowhere, expecting nothing, with his steel blue eyes watching the wet road ahead in the careful, measured way of a man who had long ago learned that the world could change without warning in the space between one breath and the next. The road curved gently through the foothills. The asphalt was dark and reflective beneath the falling rain, and the surrounding forest pressed close on both sides like a quiet wall of shadow. The headlights swung slightly as Corbett guided the truck through another bend, the beams sweeping across wet bark and dripping ferns, before settling back onto the road ahead. and it was there in that brief arc of light that something appeared at the edge of the shoulder. A small shape resting near the base of a large roadside oak tree whose thick trunk leaned over the drainage ditch beside the pavement. At first glance, the object seemed like nothing more than storm debris, perhaps a fallen branch or a clump of wet leaves caught against the roots. The shape was dark low to the ground and partially hidden by the uneven terrain around the base of the tree, but it did not move with the wind the way branches do. It remained pressed tightly against the trunk, and as the truck rolled a few feet closer, the headlights revealed the shape more clearly until Corbett felt his foot lift instinctively from the accelerator. Two small animals huddled together in the mud beneath the oak tree. Their bodies were soaked completely through, and the rain continued falling on them without mercy through the bare spaces between the branches above. Corbett slowed the truck until it came to a quiet stop along the shoulder of the road. The engine idled softly. The wipers continued their steady rhythm, and through the windshield and the pale wash of the headlights, two German shepherd puppies stared back at him with wide, dark, terrified eyes. They were small enough to fit inside a single arm. The larger puppy was a classic black and tan shepherd, perhaps 8 or 9 weeks old, with a dark saddle pattern across its back and warm brown coloring along its chest and legs. Despite the misery of the storm, the puppy remained half upright, its small body trembling violently from the cold, yet positioned forward, as though it had placed itself deliberately between the road and the smaller animal lying behind it. Its ears, still soft and floppy with youth, twitched toward the sound of the truck engine, with the cautious alertness of a dog already beginning to develop the working instincts bred into its bloodline across generations. The smaller puppy was in far worse condition. Its body lay curled tightly against the roots of the oak tree, its narrow frame pressed against the mud as though it lacked the strength to lift itself any higher. Its breathing was shallow and uneven, the thin ribs expanding weakly beneath a coat of soaked black and tan fur that clung to the bone. The puppy's eyes were half closed, and each exhale produced a faint tremor that traveled through its entire body before fading into stillness. Corbett shut off the engine and stepped out into the rain. The cold air hit his face immediately, sharp and clean and heavy with the scent of wet earth and cedar bark. Water slid from the brim of his coat and ran along the gravel shoulder as he moved toward the tree with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who understood that frightened animals responded best to calm. He crouched low in front of the puppies, lowering himself in a controlled motion that avoided any sudden movement, and rested one gloved hand open against the damp earth between them. The larger puppy noticed him first. Its head lifted slightly from the mud, and the small animal attempted a sound that might once have been a growl, but came out instead as a fragile, exhausted whimper. Despite its obvious weakness, the puppy shifted forward, positioning its body more firmly between Corbett and the smaller sibling lying behind it, as though it understood at some instinctive level that protection mattered more than self-preservation. Corbett waited. The rain continued falling around them, tapping against the oak leaves and running in thin streams through the grooves of exposed roots. The larger puppy hesitated for several seconds, its nose trembling as it tested the unfamiliar scent of leather and wood smoke and human warmth drifting from the man crouched before it. Then, slowly, it inched forward until its small black nose touched the edge of Corbett's glove. One tentative lick, then another. The gesture carried the quiet surrender of a creature too exhausted to remain afraid. Corbett slipped one arm gently beneath the smaller puppy, first lifting the fragile body carefully while its soaked fur pressed cold against his palm and revealed just how little warmth remained inside. The puppy barely stirred. Its head lolled slightly to one side, and the shallow rhythm of its breathing hitched once before settling again into the faint, uncertain pattern that separates sleep from something worse. The larger puppy scrambled forward immediately, its paws slipping in the mud as it tried to follow its sibling, and Corbett gathered it as well, before pulling both small animals beneath the shelter of his coat and rising to his feet. Their hearts beat rapidly against his chest, two tiny drums racing against the cold and the rain and the long hours of night that had nearly taken them. But before turning back toward the truck, Corbett paused. Something on the ground caught his attention in the fading reach of the headlights. The rain had softened the soil around the base of the oak tree into dark, impressionable mud, and the surface was marked with small paw prints, dozens of them scattered in the anxious pattern of animals pacing in place to keep warm. The prints of the two puppies he now held against his chest were easy to identify, their shallow impressions clustered tightly near the trunk where they had huddled together, but mixed among those tracks was a third set, nearly identical in size yet approaching from a different direction entirely. These prints came from the forest side of the drainage ditch, moving in a straight line toward the tree before stopping abruptly at the base of the trunk. The impressions were clear and deliberate, not the scattered marks of wandering, but the purposeful stride of an animal that had come to this exact spot with intention. And then the tracks simply ended. Whatever had made them had reached the oak tree, lingered for a brief moment beside the two puppies, and then vanished into the rain-washed darkness of the forest without leaving a return trail. 3 sets of paw prints beneath the tree, but only 2 puppies remained. Corbett stood there for a long moment, rain sliding down his face, the 2 small bodies pressed warm against his ribs beneath his coat. The forest beyond the drainage ditch stood dark and silent, its trees rising like black pillars into the low clouds, and the wind moved through the branches with the slow patience of something that had been watching for a very long time. He carried the puppies back to the truck and placed them gently onto the passenger seat, where the warmth from the heater began working slowly into their soaked fur. The larger puppy lifted its head immediately to confirm its sibling was still beside it, then curled its body closer in a protective arc that it had clearly been maintaining for hours. The smaller one did not move, except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. Corbett closed the door and drove through the rain toward the cabin. The road was dark. The forest was quiet. And the question of the third set of tracks followed him home like a shadow he could not outrun. At the cabin, Corbett worked quickly and patiently. He dried both puppies with old towels from the kitchen, the fabric slowly absorbing the cold rainwater trapped in their coats, while the heat from the floor vent pushed steady warmth into the room. The larger puppy recovered, first lifting its head with cautious curiosity as its amber-brown eyes scanned the unfamiliar space. Within minutes, the small dog had managed to stand on unsteady legs and take several cautious steps across the wooden floor, sniffing the boards with the bold determination of an animal whose courage had survived the storm intact. The smaller puppy remained quieter, its breathing shallow but steady, its narrow face occasionally twitching during sleep, as though the memory of the cold still lingered somewhere in its fragile mind. Corbett wrapped it carefully in a dry towel and placed both animals beside the vent where the warmth could reach them directly. He set a shallow bowl of water and some shredded chicken on the floor nearby. The larger puppy approached, first ate with quiet urgency, then nudged the smaller one with its nose until the weaker sibling stirred enough to drink. Hours passed. The rain continued its soft conversation with the roof. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. For the first time in longer than Corbett could remember, the cabin did not feel empty. The larger puppy explored the room with cautious determination, returning to its sibling after each small expedition, as though checking that the weaker animal had not vanished while unobserved. Then, sometime after midnight, a sound from outside broke the stillness. It was faint at first. A soft creaking accompanied by the uneven rhythm of something rolling across the wooden porch boards. Corbett sat up slowly in the armchair, his senses adjusting with the automatic precision that 12 years of training had wired permanently into his nervous system. The sound repeated itself. Small wheels turning under weight. The quiet roll of something being pushed carefully across damp wood. Both puppies stirred near the heater, their ears twitching toward the same direction. Corbett crossed the room and opened the front door. Standing on the porch beneath the weak glow of the overhead light was an elderly woman pushing a small two-wheeled garden cart. She appeared to be in her early 70s with silver hair tied loosely at the back of her head and pale blue eyes that held a surprising clarity despite the softness of age. She wore a long brown coat that hung loose over her thin frame, and the cart carried a woven basket covered by a folded cloth. Her name was Agnes Thorne. She lived in the old farmhouse down the road, and her presence in Pine Hollow was as familiar to the town as the church bell on Main Street, though few people truly knew the full measure of her story. "I hope I am not disturbing you this late," she said in a voice that carried the gentle tremor of someone who spent more time speaking to memories than to people. Her eyes shifted past Corbett toward the interior of the cabin where the two puppies could be seen lying near the heater vent. "I saw your truck stop by the oak tree earlier tonight while I was coming back from town. When I realized you had taken those poor little animals, I thought they might need something warm." She lifted the cloth from the basket to reveal several pieces of freshly baked cornbread wrapped in paper, the sweet scent drifting into the cold night air. Corbett stepped aside and let her in. Agnes moved slowly, but with quiet dignity, her posture slightly stooped, yet steady, as she placed the basket on the table and removed her damp coat. She knelt carefully beside the puppies with the practiced tenderness of a woman who had spent a lifetime caring for fragile things, and the larger pup lifted its head to watch her with cautious interest, while the smaller one shifted closer to its sibling for warmth. "Beautiful little shepherds," she said softly, her fingers brushing lightly across the larger puppy's ear. "My grandson used to love dogs like these." Something in her voice made Corbett ask quietly what had happened to the boy. Agnes was silent for a moment. Her gaze remained on the puppies as though the memory had returned unexpectedly through them. "His name is Eli," she said at last, with a faint smile that carried more sadness than warmth. "He is 12 years old, and he believes every stray animal deserves another chance. A few months ago, the county placed him into the foster system after some family troubles, and since then, the house down the road has felt much larger than it should." She paused, brushing a drop of rainwater from her sleeve. "Since the night Eli left, I have noticed something along that road near the oak tree." Agnes continued, her tone growing strangely reflective, while the stronger puppy stepped closer to sniff the edge of her shoe. "Every now and then, especially when the weather turns bad, it seems like something gets left beneath that tree. Small things. Animals, usually. waiting in the rain as though someone placed them there, hoping they would be found. The cabin fell quiet. The heater hummed. The puppies breathed softly. The rain whispered against the roof. And the memory of 3 sets of paw prints in the mud beneath the oak tree returned to Corbett with a clarity that refused to fade. Agnes gathered her cart and stepped back into the misty night a short while later, leaving the scent of cornbread and lavender behind her in the warm cabin air. At the door she paused and looked back at Corbett with those pale blue eyes that had seen too many winters pass without the people she loved most. "Someone is leaving those animals on purpose," she said quietly, "and I think I know who." Then she disappeared into the mist. Corbett stood in the doorway for a long time after that, watching the fog drift between the dark trees, while the 2 puppies slept by the heater behind him. 3 paw prints, a missing boy, and an old woman who believed the 2 were connected. The night was far from over, and the story waiting in those woods had only just begun to breathe. Morning arrived slowly over Pine Hollow. The rain had thinned during the hours before dawn into a pale gray mist that hung low between the treetops and the rooflines of the small logging town, as though the sky could not quite decide whether to clear or to close again. The roads remained dark with moisture, the air heavy with the scent of wet cedar and riverstone, while the distant hum of early trucks along the timber highway echoed faintly through the surrounding hills like the pulse of a world that continued turning, regardless of what had happened in the night. Inside the cabin, the change was quieter, but no less real. The heater hummed its steady rhythm. The clock ticked above the kitchen doorway, and on the floor beside the vent, 2 German shepherd puppies lay together on a nest of old towels that still carried the faint smell of rain and the particular warmth of small bodies pressed close through a long night of survival. The larger puppy woke first. Its amber-brown eyes opened with the sharp focus common to working-line shepherds. Even at the earliest age, a genetic inheritance of alertness passed through generations of dogs bred to watch, to guard, to notice what others overlooked. Within seconds, the small dog was on its feet, investigating the cabin floor with a bold curiosity that seemed too large for its body. It sniffed the table legs. It stood on its hind legs to inspect the leather armchair. It examined Corbett's boots near the door with the thorough concentration of a soldier studying unfamiliar terrain, and when it finally looked up and found Corbett watching from across the room, the puppy crossed the floor in a direct line and placed one firm paw against his knee. The gesture was not tentative. It was not the careful retreating touch of an animal testing boundaries. It was a declaration. A small creature, planting its flag on the only solid ground it had found since the storm. Corbett looked down at the puppy and felt something shift behind his ribs. Not dramatic, not the kind of feeling that announces itself with force or clarity. Just a slight loosening of something that had been held tight for so long. He had forgotten it was there, like the first thread of a knot beginning to give after years of rain and pressure had worked against it in silence. He placed his hand on the puppy's head. "Titan," he said. The name arrived without deliberation, as though it had been waiting for the right creature to carry it. Titan. Something immense contained inside something small. The second puppy required a different name entirely. The smaller shepherd still lay beside the heater vent, curled into a tight crescent beneath the towel, breathing shallow but steady. It had survived the night, not through strength or boldness, but through a stillness so complete It had made itself nearly invisible against the dark floor. Even now, in the warming light of morning, the puppy seemed to exist at the very edge of perception, a presence so quiet that looking away from it for a moment created the unsettling feeling it might have vanished while unobserved. "Ghost," Corbett said softly, "because something that survives when every measure suggests it should not is no longer entirely ordinary. It moves through the world with the silence of a thing that knows how close it came to not being here at all." Titan understood his brother's fragility without instruction. Each time the larger puppy finished exploring a corner of the cabin, he returned immediately to Ghost's side, pressing his warm body close and resting his chin across Ghost's shoulder in a gesture of protection so instinctive it seemed to predate their birth, as though the bond between them had been formed somewhere before memory, in a place where the responsibilities of the strong toward the vulnerable were not taught, but simply known. Corbett fed them again, warm water and shredded chicken from the refrigerator. Titan ate with focused urgency, then nudged Ghost with his nose until the smaller puppy stirred enough to drink on its own. That Ghost could drink without assistance was a small victory, Corbett noted with quiet precision, the way a man accustomed to measuring progress in careful increments notes the first sign that a situation is moving in a direction that might eventually become favorable. The cabin felt different with them in it, not transformed, not rescued from its emptiness by sudden warmth, but altered in the subtle way that a room changes when the silence inside it is no longer the only thing breathing. Small sounds softened the edges of the space, the click of claws on wood, the rustle of towels, occasional whimpers during sleep, the gentle tapping of a small paw against the floor when Titan rose to investigate a sound only he could hear. These noises did not fill the cabin so much as they gave the silence something to lean against. He loaded both puppies into the truck and drove toward town. The Fort Pine Animal Rescue Clinic occupied a faded brick building at the far end of Main Street, its entrance marked by a crooked metal sign shaped like a paw print that swayed gently in the damp morning air. The parking lot held nothing but a battered Subaru wagon and a stack of hay bales leaning against the side wall. Inside, the air carried the familiar combination of antiseptic wet fur and coffee that had been reheated one too many times on the clinic's ancient hot plate. Lena Hargrove looked up from a clipboard as Corbett entered. She was a woman in her middle 30s with an athletic build shaped by years of lifting frightened animals and hauling supply crates through the narrow back corridors of the clinic. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder. Faint scratches in various stages of healing lined her forearms beneath the rolled sleeves of her navy clinic jacket, the accumulated evidence of a career spent working with creatures that arrived scared, neglected, or half-wild from the surrounding forests. Her eyes a steady, clear green that reminded Corbett of shallow river water moving over stone, held the calm focus of someone who had learned early that patience and observation mattered more than words. Lena was the daughter of a former forest ranger who had raised her along the mountain trails of Pine Hollow. She returned to the valley after veterinary school in Portland because it needed someone who understood that healing sometimes meant simply showing up. Her expression softened when she saw Ghost in Corbett's arms, and she motioned toward the examination table without unnecessary words. "Let us take a look at this one," Titan positioned himself directly below the table body, rigid with attention, tracking every movement Lena's hands made across Ghost's body with the unblinking intensity of a dog that had appointed himself guardian of all proceedings involving his brother's welfare. Lena placed a stethoscope against Ghost's chest and listened for a long time. Her fingers moved through the coat along the ribs, the spine, the joints with the gentle thoroughness of hands that understood exactly how much pressure a fragile body could accept. Then she lifted one of Ghost's small front paws and turned it carefully in the light. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "This puppy has not just been out in the rain," she said. Her voice shifted from warmth to the measured precision she used when findings demanded clarity. The lungs sound irritated, not from one night of exposure. This inflammation develops over days, maybe weeks, of breathing damp, poorly ventilated air. Mold. Possibly ammonia. The atmosphere found in enclosed spaces where animals are kept without adequate airflow. She turned the paw so Corbett could see clearly. The pads were raw, not cut or torn, but worn in a smooth, even pattern across the entire surface, abraded down to the pink layer beneath the toughened outer skin. "This wear comes from standing on wire mesh or metal grating for extended periods," Lena continued quietly. "Hours, days. The pads never get a chance to rest or recover because the animal stands on the same abrasive surface continuously. These puppies were not abandoned by a careless owner. They were confined somewhere damp, poorly maintained, and very small. For a long time. The examination room fell silent except for the soft whir of the overhead light and Titan's steady breathing beneath the table. Corbett told her everything. The oak tree, the storm, the two puppies in the mud. He described it in the precise language of field reports, and Lena listened without interrupting while preparing a fluid injection for Ghost. "Over the past few months," she said while working, "we have had scattered reports from hikers and small breeders around the outer valleys. Missing litters. Puppies vanishing overnight from private properties. Each time someone tries to follow up, the trail goes cold before anyone with authority gets involved. I have been keeping notes, but no one has been able to connect the cases." She injected the fluids carefully beneath Ghost's skin. Titan whined once sharp and anxious, and Lena paused to scratch behind his ear with the absent tenderness of a woman who had reassured thousands of frightened animals without ever losing the instinct. "Easy there. Your brother is tougher than he looks." Corbett's gaze had drifted toward the reception counter. Among the community flyers beside the sign-in sheet, one piece of paper held him. A missing person notice with a photograph at the top. A boy of 12, dark hair falling unevenly across his forehead, a thin face with features not yet fully formed into the adult they would become, and serious brown eyes that looked considerably older than the rest of his young features, as though they had spent their short years observing things most children were protected from seeing. Missing juvenile, Eli Thorne, age 12, absent from county foster placement. Below the printed text, someone had added a handwritten line in careful blue ink. Often seen helping injured animals in the forest trails. Corbett read the line twice. The name had already surfaced the previous night. Agnes had spoken it on his porch in the mist, with worry in her pale eyes and cornbread in her basket. He folded the flyer and placed it in his jacket pocket. When he looked up, Lena was watching him with an expression that was not surprise but confirmation, the recognition of someone who has carried a suspicion alone, and has just realized another person has arrived at the same doorstep. "You are not the first person to bring in puppies like these," she said, "but you are the first one who noticed the wounds." Agnes Thorne's farmhouse appeared through the mist at the far bend of the road, a weathered two-story structure surrounded by old apple trees whose bare branches reached toward the gray sky with the stubborn persistence of living things that have stopped producing fruit but continue reaching because they have forgotten how to do anything else. Corbett had not planned to stop, but a large black pickup truck was parked in front of the house, newer and more expensive than anything belonging on this stretch of road. Tires caked with fresh mud, engine still ticking with recent heat. On the porch, two figures stood facing each other. Agnes was small in her brown shawl hands, clasped tightly shoulders, drawn inward with the unmistakable posture of a woman holding herself together against a pressure she had endured many times before. The man opposite her occupied space in a fundamentally different way. Tall and broad through the chest, carrying the heavy mass of decades of physical labor, followed by comfortable years that added weight without removing the underlying strength. Reddish-brown hair thinning combed back from a wide forehead, an expensive canvas jacket over flannel, hands that moved in small controlled gestures when he spoke, directing conversation the way a foreman directs a crew. His name was Dwight Thorne. He was the younger brother of Agnes's late husband, and his interest in this farmhouse was not familial affection. Dwight held legal management authority over the old sawmill property deep in the forest behind the Thorne acreage land inherited through his father, and for the past year he had been pressuring Agnes to sell the farmhouse and surrounding land at a price designed to sound generous while being anything but. Corbett stepped out of the truck. Both figures turned. Agnes's expression shifted with something quick and carefully hidden that looked like relief. Dwight turned slowly without surprise and studied Corbett with the evaluating gaze of a man who cataloged people in terms of what they could offer and what they might cost. His eyes moved once from boots to face, paused on the squared shoulders and steady gaze, and produced a smile that traveled no further than his lips. "You must be the neighbor," Agnes mentioned. The voice was warm and practiced, carrying the friendliness of a man who understood that controlling the temperature of a conversation was more effective than controlling its volume. He extended a large hand. "Dwight Thorne, family business, nothing worth anyone's attention." Corbett shook the hand. The grip held a fraction longer than necessary, the kind of handshake that communicates strength being restrained rather than absent. "This part of the valley does not get much excitement." Dwight continued, smile, unchanged eyes watchful beneath. "Just rain and trees and old property matters. The kind of thing that sorts itself out among family. Not really the sort of business that benefits from outside involvement." The words were shaped like friendliness. Their content was something else entirely. Corbett said nothing. He stood at the base of the porch steps and watched Dwight Thorne with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had spent 12 years in observation positions waiting for the small inconsistency that reveals where danger is hiding. He did not need to speak. Silence itself communicated everything, and Dwight, for all his practiced confidence, was not accustomed to people who wielded silence as a tool rather than an absence. The moment held for several seconds longer than Dwight seemed comfortable with. Then he adjusted his jacket collar, nodded once to Agnes in a gesture combining farewell with reminder, and descended the steps with the deliberate stride of a man who wanted his departure to look like a choice. His black truck pulled away in a spray of gravel and the low growl of an engine built to announce itself. Agnes stood on the porch until the sound disappeared into the trees. Then the composure she had been maintaining released in a long, unsteady breath. Her eyes were red. Not from tears already fallen, but from the sustained effort of holding them back, while a man twice her size explained why she should give up her home. "He wants this land," she said quietly, looking at the trees rather than at Corbett. "Since my husband passed, and now that Eli is not here, he believes I have no reason left to hold on." She drew the shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. "Dwight holds the only legal key to the old sawmill property in those woods. The land belonged to his father before everything shut down. If someone wanted to use that place for something they did not want discovered, Dwight is the only person who could come and go without raising a single question." That night, the cabin was dark, except for the faint glow of the heater vent where Titan and Ghost lay together in their nest of towels. Corbett sat in the armchair with the lights off, thinking about wire cages and missing litters, and a man who smiled without warmth and spoke about family business in a voice calibrated to make questions feel unwelcome. The rain had returned, steady, patient, falling against the roof in a rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock on the wall. Shortly before midnight, Titan's head snapped upward from the floor. The movement was sudden and precise. Not the lazy stirring of a puppy disturbed by a dream, but the focused snap of a working dog detecting a change in its environment. His ears rotated forward and locked onto a fixed point beyond the cabin walls. His body went rigid, every muscle drawn tight. And from somewhere deep inside his small chest, a low growl emerged, steady and serious and deliberate. The unmistakable sound of a dog that has identified something specific moving through the darkness and has determined it does not belong there. Ghost pressed closer to Titan without waking, responding to the vibration of the growl through the contact of their bodies. Corbett rose and moved to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass at the far end of the road where the pavement curved into forest, two red taillights glowed faintly in the mist. A vehicle was moving along the logging road that led into the woods behind the old sawmill property. No headlights. Only the dim red glow at the rear pulsing once when the brakes engaged at the turn before the tree line. Then the lights disappeared into the forest, and the night closed behind them as though nothing had passed through it at all. Corbett did not sleep. He remained in the armchair through the remaining hours, eyes open, breathing, steady hands resting on the chair arms in the balanced, motionless posture that 12 years of operational service had trained into his nervous system at a level deeper than conscious thought. The rain continued. The heater cycled. Titan lay with his head on Corbett's boot ears still oriented toward the front of the cabin, listening for the thing that had passed through the darkness and might return. At some point in the deep hours before dawn, when the rain had softened to a whisper and the forest outside had grown so still that individual drops could be heard falling from cedar branches onto the porch railing, Corbett closed his eyes. He did not intend to sleep, but the past does not wait for permission. The village arrived the way it always arrived, not gradually, not as fragments assembling into memory, as sudden immersion, a door opening beneath him, a fall into a world that smelled of dust and diesel and the sharp, acrid edge of structures burning in dry mountain air. Eastern Afghanistan, a valley settlement of mud brick houses along a riverbed whose stones had turned white from years without water. Late afternoon. Corbett's squad had reached it during a reconnaissance sweep. The village was empty. The inhabitants had fled in haste, leaving overturned cooking vessels, a child's sandal in the dust, a blanket caught on a doorframe. But behind a collapsed fence at the settlement's edge, 3 dogs stood in a narrow enclosure. 2 adults and 1 younger animal, thin enough that ribs showed through matted coats. Watching the soldiers pass with the patient, silent resignation of creatures whose opinions about their circumstances were not being consulted by anyone, Corbett stopped walking. The squad was ahead, moving toward the ridge. The light was failing. The mission brief included no provisions for animals. But he stood at that fence and looked at those dogs and felt something open inside his chest that had been held closed for a very long time. He could have opened the gate. He could have poured water from his canteen into the dry trough and given 3 abandoned animals a few more hours of life in a place where life had become an act of defiance against forces too large to name. Hail, move. The order came across the comms in the flat, undeniable tone that meant a decision had already been made above his level. The squad was pulling ahead, shadows stretching. Nightfall in this province carried risks that required no explanation. Corbett left the dogs behind the fence. He turned his back on 3 animals watching him, with eyes that expected nothing and feared everything, and he followed his team up the ridge, because that was what the mission required. And he was a man who had built his entire identity on the principle that the mission came first. The airstrike hit the village the following morning. Intelligence had determined the buildings would serve as an insurgent staging area. The decision was made far above Corbett's rank. He learned of it only after the explosions had stopped echoing across the mountains and smoke drifted heavy over the riverbed. He never returned to see what remained. The mathematics of high-explosive ordnance and mud brick walls and thin metal fencing produced an answer that did not require physical verification. The dogs behind the collapsed fence were not behind anything anymore. That was when something essential broke inside Corbett Hale, not visibly, not in any way that appeared in an after-action report or drew the attention of the squad medic. But in the quiet space behind his ribs, where a man keeps his beliefs about himself and about the way the world is supposed to work, something fractured along a line so deep that the full extent of the damage would take years to become apparent. He stopped believing that following orders was always the same as doing right. He stopped trusting that the mission justified every cost it demanded. And he began the slow, invisible process of separating from the life he had built, pulling away from his team and his purpose. Until 2 years later, he sat alone in a cabin in Oregon, unable to sleep, unable to stay still, unable to explain to anyone, including himself, exactly what he had lost in that village, or why the loss continued growing instead of fading. Titan licked his hand. Small, warm, insistent. The sensation cut through the memory like a blade through fog. Corbett opened his eyes. Gray dawn light filled the cabin. The puppy stood on hind legs with paws braced on the chair arm, licking Corbett's fingers with the focused, determined urgency of an animal that understood its human had traveled somewhere dangerous in his sleep and needed to be brought back. Ghost lay at the base of the chair, pressed against the wooden leg as though he had positioned himself there during the night as an anchor, a small weight holding the present in place against the pull of the past. Corbett exhaled slowly and ran his hand along Titan's ears. "I am still here," he said quietly. Whether he was speaking to the dogs or to himself, he could not have said, with certainty. Agnes came to the cabin later that morning. She arrived on foot carrying a thermos of chicken soup and bread wrapped in cloth. She entered with the unhesitating efficiency of a woman who had been delivering food and comfort to people in difficult circumstances for so many decades. The act was indistinguishable from breathing. They sat at the kitchen table. The soup filled the room with rosemary and slow-cooked broth, and the particular warmth that exists not only in food, but in the choice to prepare it for someone else. The puppies investigated Agnes's shoes with great interest, and Titan eventually settled beside her chair with his chin resting on her foot, a gesture of acceptance the old woman received with a small, sad smile. For a while they spoke of ordinary things, the roads after the storm, the leaking gutter, the price of firewood since the mill closed. Then Agnes looked at the puppies beside the heater, and her expression changed. "Eli was always this way," she said in the tone of someone who has begun sharing a memory before deciding whether it will bring comfort or pain. "From the time he could walk, he brought things home. A baby bird fallen from a nest. A cat with a broken leg behind the gas station. Once he carried an injured raccoon 2 miles through the rain in his school backpack because he was afraid it would die alone in the dark." She smiled, but the smile was thin and fragile, stretched across, feeling so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "When the county took him, I told him it was temporary. The system would sort things out. But Eli did not believe in systems. He believed in one thing only, that if you could see suffering and you had the power to help, then walking past was the same as causing it. No middle ground, no gray area. Suffering existed, and you either stood in front of it or you walked away, and the choice was the only thing about you that mattered." Agnes wrapped both hands around the thermos as though drawing warmth from it against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Since Eli ran from the placement, I have known he came back to Pine Hollow. But he did not come to me. He went into the forest, and every night since I have sat at my kitchen table in the dark, asking God what my grandson found out there that was important enough to keep a 12-year-old boy hiding in the woods instead of coming home to the only family he has left." The cabin was very still. Rain tapped the windows. The heater settled into silence. Titan had stopped moving, watching Agnes with an attention that seemed to exceed what was possible in a puppy. Ghost lay pressed against Corbett's boot, eyes half closed, breathing the careful breaths of a creature whose body still remembered what it felt like to not be safe. Agnes lifted her gaze and looked directly at Corbett. The gentle tremor that had characterized her voice since they met was gone, replaced by something harder, something forged over months of solitary worry and sleepless nights, the voice of a woman who had been patient as long as patience served purpose, and had arrived at the place where it must become something else or destroy her. "I am afraid Eli found something in those woods he was never meant to find," she said. "And I am afraid that Dwight knows exactly what it is." The words settled into the room and stayed there. Corbett looked at Agnes across the table, at the puppies whose damaged paws told the story of wire cages and prolonged confinement. Through the window at the darkening tree line where the forest pressed close and the mist was thickening again between the trunks. He thought about a man who drove without headlights into the woods at midnight, about a boy with serious eyes who believed walking past suffering was the same as causing it. The pieces were not yet a picture, but they were drifting toward each other with the slow certainty of things that belong in the same frame and Corbett could feel the pull of their convergence in the same deep, instinctive place where he had once felt missions turning more dangerous than the briefing had prepared him for. Outside, the rain intensified, and somewhere in the dark forest surrounding Pine Hollow, a boy who would not walk past suffering was waiting for someone who believed the same thing he did. The mist that had hovered over Pine Hollow during the morning began thickening again by early afternoon, the sky lowering into a dull sheet of gray that pressed against the forested hills surrounding the town. By the time Corbett turned his truck onto the narrow county road leading toward the oak tree where he had found the puppies, the air had already begun to darken with the weight of another approaching storm. Titan sat upright on the passenger seat with his ears forward and his small body angled toward the windshield, watching the road with the focused attention of a dog that had somehow understood that the purpose of this drive was different from the morning's trip to the clinic. Ghost lay beside him in the wool blanket, sleeping with the deep stillness of an animal whose body was using every available calorie to repair itself. The forest looked different in daylight, yet no less secretive. Towering fir trees stood in silent ranks along both sides of the road, their branches dripping steadily from the lingering moisture, while the earth beneath them held the dark smell of wet soil and fallen needles that had been decomposing slowly for decades. Corbett parked along the same gravel shoulder where he had stopped the previous night. The oak tree stood as he had left it, its thick trunk leaning over the drainage ditch, its roots spreading through the dark mud like the fingers of a hand pressed flat against the ground. The rain from the night before had softened the soil enough to erase most of the paw prints he had noticed earlier, yet the ground still carried a subtle disturbance that his trained eyes caught immediately. Faint depressions leading away from the roadside ditch, moving toward the thicker part of the forest as though someone or something had traveled quickly into the trees. Years of military service had taught Corbett to read ground patterns the way other people read printed words on a page. Even blurred by rain, the remaining marks revealed enough to guide his attention toward a narrow path hidden behind a cluster of young cedar trees. The trail was not a proper hiking route, but the sort of makeshift track created when vehicles occasionally passed over soft ground. The soil held a clearer impression there, suggesting the recent passage of a light truck, and the tread pattern had pressed into the mud at a slight angle before continuing deeper into the woods. A few yards further along, he noticed something scattered among the wet leaves. Small fragments of dry kibble, cheap commercial-grade dog food, the kind purchased in bulk rather than for individual animals. The pieces had softened in the damp air but had fallen recently enough that the rain had not yet dissolved them completely. Corbett followed the trail, carefully moving deeper between the tall trees where the forest floor became uneven and shadowed beneath the canopy. The light dimmed as the canopy thickened overhead, filtering the gray sky into muted darkness. The smell of wet bark gradually mixed with another scent that grew stronger with each step, something faintly chemical beneath the earthy odor of the woods. Ammonia, cleaning agents. And underneath those, the older, heavier smell of animal confinement that clings to enclosed spaces long after the animals themselves have been removed. After several minutes, the path widened and revealed the rusted remains of an old logging structure hidden behind a slope of overgrown brush. The building had once been part of a small sawmill operation, the sort that had dotted the outskirts of Pine Hollow decades earlier when the timber industry still sustained the valley. Now only the skeletal outline remained. A collapsed wooden shed beside a rusted conveyor frame and broken boards half buried in moss. Beyond the ruins, partially concealed by leaning stacks of discarded planks, stood a smaller structure that drew Corbett's attention immediately. The shack looked hastily repaired rather than abandoned. Its wooden walls had been patched with mismatched boards nailed roughly into place. A metal chain hung across the door. As a crude lock, though the latch showed signs of frequent use, the metal worn smooth from hands that opened and closed it regularly. Corbett approached slowly. The chemical smell was unmistakable, now carrying the sharp edge of cleaning agents mixed with something far less pleasant. When he reached the door, the scent of damp fur and stale confinement became clear enough to tell him what he would find before he saw it. The chain slipped easily from the latch. Inside, the air felt colder than the forest, thick with mold and the sour residue of ammonia that lingers where animals have been held in tight quarters without ventilation. Light filtered through cracked boards along the walls, falling in narrow strips across a dirt floor that had been packed hard by the weight of things being dragged across it repeatedly. The interior was narrow, no larger than a single car garage, and the low ceiling made the space feel closer, more suffocating, as though the building itself had been designed to contain things that were not supposed to be seen. Several metal cages had been arranged in uneven rows against the back wall. Most stood empty now, but the floors inside them showed deep scratches carved into the metal surfaces, the marks of animals that had struggled there for extended periods, pawing at the wire with a desperation that had etched itself permanently into the steel. Tufts of black and tan fur clung to the mesh in small clumps that the forest air had not yet carried away. In one corner, a plastic feed bucket sat half filled with the same cheap kibble he had found along the path. And beside it, a water trough had been overturned, its rim stained with a greenish residue that suggested the water had not been changed in a very long time. Near the center of the room lay a pile of charred paper fragments in a dented metal tray. Someone had attempted to burn documents in a hurry. Corbett knelt beside the tray and carefully lifted one partially scorched page. The edges were blackened, but the printed text remained legible in places. The paper appeared to be part of a shipping manifest listing transport routes and dates alongside coded descriptions. Several entries used abbreviations associated with dog breeding operations. Some lines included state names: Idaho, Nevada, Northern California. Shipments crossing state borders through secondary highways rather than official routes. Corbett photographed each fragment with his phone before the remaining moisture could destroy what the fire had not. While examining the pages, his gaze shifted toward the far corner of the shack where something small lay partly hidden beneath a broken wooden crate. He moved the crate aside. A child's raincoat. Bright yellow, once now stained with mud and dampened by the forest air. The coat appeared to belong to someone around 12 years old, the sleeves narrow and the hood lined with thin reflective strips used on children's outdoor clothing. One pocket had been torn slightly, as though it had caught on something sharp while being pulled away in haste. Beneath the coat rested a small folding knife. Its handle was scratched from use but still sturdy. Along the side of the blade, someone had carved a name with uneven, careful letters: Eli. Corbett remained crouched there for a long moment, holding the knife, while the quiet of the forest seeped through the gaps in the shack walls. The discovery aligned too precisely with the missing child flyer at the clinic, and with Agnes Thorne's hesitant words about a grandson who believed every stray animal deserved saving. If this boy had found this place before Corbett did, then the scene inside the shack told a story that suddenly made sense. A child who rescued animals would not have walked past rows of cages in a hidden building. He would have done exactly what the evidence suggested. He would have opened the doors. He would have carried the weakest ones out through the forest. and he would have left them beneath a roadside tree where someone passing in the night might see them before the men who ran this operation returned. Corbett brought the evidence to Lena at the clinic. Together, they pieced together the fragments. The charred manifests matched the timeline of missing litter reports Lena had been documenting. The shipping route suggested an organized operation that moved animals across state lines through back roads. And the condition of the cages, the wire flooring the ammonia residue, matched precisely with the injuries Lena had found on Ghost's paws and lungs. Lena pulled veterinary records from the past several months and spread them across the examination table beside the photographs Corbett had taken inside the shack. Her expression tightened as the pattern emerged from the data with the slow, undeniable clarity of a shape forming inside fog. The litters that had been reported missing from small breeders in the outer valleys had not disappeared randomly. They had vanished in a geographical arc that circled outward from the old sawmill property, like ripples spreading from a stone dropped into still water. And the most recent disappearances, the ones closest in time to Corbett, finding the puppies beneath the oak tree clustered tightly near the acreage behind Agnes Thorne's farmhouse, the same land Dwight had been pressuring her to sell for over a year. If he gets that land, Lena said quietly, looking up from the records, the access road from the sawmill connects directly to the county highway without passing through town. He could move animals in and out without anyone seeing a thing. The full picture was forming now. Everything Dwight Thorne had done, pressuring Agnes, pushing Eli out through the foster system, maintaining sole access to the sawmill property, served a single purpose. The land was not valuable for development. It was valuable because it provided concealment. Corbett drove back to the sawmill property that afternoon to retrieve additional evidence. What he found stopped him at the entrance to the path. The shack door hung open. The chain lay coiled on the ground like a dead snake, and inside, every cage had been removed. The feed buckets were gone. The charred paper tray was gone. The water trough had vanished. The floor had been swept roughly with a broom whose bristle marks were still visible in the damp dirt, creating long parallel lines that ran from one wall to the other, like the marks of something being deliberately erased. Even the tufts of fur that had clung to the wire mesh had been pulled away with what must have been considerable effort, leaving only faint scratch marks on the walls where the cages had rested. Someone had cleaned the entire building in the hour since Corbett's first visit. The only evidence that anything had ever happened inside the shack was the lingering smell of ammonia and the scratch marks on the floor that no broom could erase. Every physical piece of proof, every cage, every document, every fragment that could have been presented to authorities had vanished. Dwight knew someone had been inside. And he had moved faster than Corbett anticipated. Corbett found Dwight Thorne the following morning at the Pine Hollow Grill, a small diner on Main Street, where the loggers and construction workers gathered for breakfast before the early shifts. Dwight sat in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, his canvas jacket draped across the seat beside him, a folded newspaper resting untouched on the table. He looked entirely at ease in the way that only a man who believes himself beyond consequence can look when the ground beneath him should be shifting. Corbett sat down across from him without being invited. Dwight looked up slowly, chewing, and produced the same measured smile he had worn on Agnes's porch. The same warmth that stopped at the lips. The same evaluating stillness behind the eyes. "Twice in 2 days," Dwight said, setting down his fork. "People might start thinking we are friends." Corbett said nothing for a moment. He studied the man across the table, the way he had once studied terrain maps before entering hostile territory, looking not at the surface, but at what the surface was designed to conceal. "I found your sawmill property yesterday," Corbett said. His voice was level and unhurried, carrying no accusation and no heat. Simply a statement of fact placed on the table between them like a card turned face up. Dwight's expression did not change, not even slightly. He lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and set the cup down with a deliberate steadiness that communicated absolute control over the moment. "That property has been in my family for 40 years, Dwight replied. "I have been cleaning it up, getting it ready for sale. Old equipment, scrap wood, all sorts of junk accumulated over the decades. Nothing unusual about clearing out a building you intend to put on the market." The words were perfectly reasonable. Every sentence constructed to sound exactly like what an honest man would say if he were simply maintaining a family property. Then Dwight leaned forward slightly. "That boy," he said, and the temperature of his voice dropped by several degrees without his smile changing at all. "Eli, my nephew. You should know that I have already contacted the county sheriff's department about him." Corbett waited. "Eli Thorne is not a missing child who needs rescuing." Dwight continued, his words measured and precise. "He is a juvenile who has repeatedly fled lawful custody and has been trespassing on private property that belongs to my family. I have filed a formal complaint. Breaking and entering. Destruction of property. Theft." He paused and lifted one hand in a small gesture that managed to combine sympathy with dismissal. "I understand his grandmother believes he is some kind of young hero saving animals in the forest. But what he has actually been doing is breaking into a building he has no legal right to enter and damaging equipment that costs money to replace." The diner continued its ordinary morning rhythm around them, forks against plates, coffee being poured. The low murmur of conversation between men who had no idea what was being discussed in the corner booth. Corbett felt the words rearrange the entire landscape of the situation in his mind, with the cold precision of a chessboard being cleared and reset in the middle of a game he thought he had been winning. Dwight was not running. He was not hiding. He was not panicking because someone had discovered the shack. He had anticipated this moment long before it arrived. He had prepared for it the way a man who has operated outside the law for years prepares for the inevitable day when someone gets close enough to ask questions. And his preparation was devastatingly simple in its elegance. He had turned the story inside out. In Dwight's version, there were no cages, no shipping manifests, no imprisoned animals. There was only a family property being cleaned for sale, and a troubled foster child who had been vandalizing it. The physical evidence was gone. The shack was empty. And if Eli were found by authorities before anyone else reached him, the boy would not be treated as a witness. He would be processed as a juvenile offender. His testimony about cages and trucks and animals in distress would be dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a child trying to justify criminal behavior. Everything Corbett and Lena had built in their minds over the past 2 days, the connection between the missing litters and the sawmill, the link between Dwight's pressure on Agnes and the hidden operation, all of it now rested on the word of a former soldier and a small-town veterinarian against the legal position of a property owner who had already filed official complaints. The photographs Corbett had taken inside the shack were something, but photographs of an empty room with scratch marks on the floor were not cages full of puppies. They were not shipping manifests. They were images that a competent lawyer could explain away in 5 minutes. Dwight watched Corbett absorb this realization. The smile remained. Patient, confident. "I hope the boy is found safely," Dwight said, standing and placing a folded bill beside his coffee cup. "He needs help. Professional help. The kind that a foster facility is equipped to provide. Not the kind that comes from well-meaning strangers who do not fully understand the family situation." He pulled on his jacket, nodded once, and walked out of the diner. Corbett remained in the booth. The sounds of the restaurant continued around him, ordinary and indifferent. But inside his mind, every assumption he had been building since the night beneath the oak tree had been detonated and reassembled into a shape he had not anticipated. If Dwight's complaint reached the sheriff before Eli was found, the boy would be arrested, returned to custody, labeled a delinquent, and the only living witness to what had actually happened inside that shack would be silenced not by violence, but by procedure. Corbett needed to find Eli before the system did, and he needed proof that the system could not dismiss. He needed the boy, and he needed the dog that the boy had taken with him when he fled into the forest, the animal whose body carried the physical evidence of confinement that no amount of sweeping could erase. He left the diner and drove toward the clinic, where Lena was already waiting with the veterinary records spread across the counter. When he told her what Dwight had said, her expression hardened into something Corbett had not seen on her face before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. The focused, quiet determination of a woman who had spent her career protecting creatures that could not protect themselves and had just been told that the system meant to deliver justice might instead be used to bury it. "Then we do not wait for the system," she said. Through the clinic window, the sky had turned the color of dark iron. The storm that had been building all day was no longer approaching. It was here. The first heavy drops of rain struck the glass like small fists knocking for entry, and in the distance, thunder rolled across the hills with the deep, patient sound of something that had been gathering strength for a long time and was finally ready to arrive. Corbett looked at Lena. He looked at Titan, who stood beside his boots with ears forward and body rigid, staring toward the window as though the storm itself were a living thing he intended to challenge. He looked at Ghost, curled in the blanket on the counter, breathing softly alive because a 12-year-old boy had carried him through the darkness to a place where someone might find him. He had one night. One night before Dwight's complaint moved through the county system and transformed a missing child into a wanted juvenile. One night before the sheriff's deputies began searching for Eli Thorne, not as a boy who needed help, but as a suspect who needed apprehension. One night of storm and flooding and darkness in a forest that stretched for miles across the hills surrounding Pine Hollow. A forest where a 12-year-old boy with a fever and an injured dog were hiding in the cold because the world that was supposed to protect them had instead become the thing they were hiding from. And somewhere inside that wilderness, waiting in a place that no map marked and no road reached, was the only evidence that could prove what Dwight Thorne had done. A wounded mother dog whose body carried the truth in her matted fur and damaged flesh. And a boy whose testimony could bring the entire operation down if anyone found him in time to listen. The rain struck the clinic window harder now, running down the glass in sheets that blurred the world outside into formless gray. Corbett stood. It was the only chance any of them had left. The storm arrived over Pine Hollow with the slow, deliberate, unstoppable weight of something that had been gathering strength across the Pacific for days and had finally decided to make landfall. The sky did not darken gradually the way it does before ordinary rain. It collapsed. One moment the clouds were a heavy gray ceiling pressing low against the hilltops, and the next they had turned the color of wet iron, swallowing the last of the afternoon light until the forest surrounding the town looked as though night had arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule. The wind came first, bending the tops of the Douglas firs along the ridgeline in long sweeping arcs that sent cascades of water from their branches onto the already saturated ground below. Then the rain followed, not falling so much as being driven sideways through the air in thick silver sheets that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards and turned every road in the valley into a shallow, moving river. Inside the cabin, Corbett sat at the kitchen table with a topographic map of the Pine Hollow Valley spread before him, its creased surface marked with pencil lines he had drawn during the past hour while the storm intensified outside. The map showed the network of logging roads, hiking trails, and seasonal creek beds that threaded through the mountains behind the old sawmill property, and Corbett had been studying the terrain with the focused concentration of a man who understood that the difference between finding someone in a forest at night and losing them forever often came down to knowing which ridgeline held firm in a flood and which one turned to mud. Titan sat beside his chair with his head resting on Corbett's thigh, the puppy's amber eyes tracking between the map and the window where rain hammered against the glass in violent bursts. The small dog had been restless since the storm began, pacing between the door and the heater vent where Ghost lay sleeping as though his body could feel the urgency building inside the cabin walls, even before the humans had spoken it aloud. Lena arrived just before dark. She came through the door with rain streaming from her jacket and a canvas bag slung over one shoulder that contained every veterinary record she had compiled over the past 4 months. Her hair had come loose from its braid and clung to her neck in wet strands, and her green eyes held the particular brightness that appears in people who have made a difficult decision and are no longer interested in discussing whether it was wise. She set the bag on the table beside the map and looked at Corbett. "Those records are the only documentation that still exists connecting the missing litters to the sawmill property," she said. Dwight cleaned the building. He filed his complaint. By tomorrow morning, the official story will be that Eli Thorne is a juvenile delinquent who broke into a family storage shed and caused property damage. Every hour we wait makes that story harder to undo. Corbett said nothing for a moment. He looked at the map. He looked at the storm raging beyond the window. He looked at Titan, who had risen to his feet and was staring at the front door with the rigid attention of a dog that wanted to go outside and could not understand why the door remained closed. Then Lena said the thing that changed everything. "If you go into that forest alone and something happens to you, who finds Eli?" The question landed in the silence between them with the precision of a nail driven into wood. Corbett felt it strike something inside his chest that he had been protecting for a very long time. The instinct to operate alone. The deep, trained conviction that depending on others created vulnerability, and vulnerability in the field meant people died. It was the principle that had governed every mission he had ever run, every decision he had ever made under pressure. And it was the same principle that had eventually driven him into a cabin at the edge of a small town where he sat in an empty room night after night because he had forgotten how to let another human being close enough to matter. Lena was not asking him to abandon the mission. She was asking him to change the way he conducted it. For a man who had spent 12 years believing that solitude was safety, the request felt more dangerous than the storm outside. But she was right. The Afghanistan flashback returned one final time. not the village, not the dogs behind the fence. Something older. A night extraction that had gone wrong in the mountains south of Kandahar when Corbett's squad leader had refused to split the team despite pressure from command to send a single operator ahead. "We go together or we do not go," the man had said, and those words had saved 4 lives that night, because the route they found required 4 sets of hands to navigate, not one. Corbett had spent 2 years remembering only the missions that proved isolation was safer. He had forgotten the ones that proved the opposite. He picked up the phone and called Sheriff Bowen. The conversation was brief and direct. Corbett laid out everything: the shack, the cages, the photographs, the manifests, the veterinary evidence, Dwight's cleanup, and his preemptive complaint against Eli. Bowen listened without interruption, and when Corbett finished, the sheriff's response was honest in the way that only a man who has enforced the law in a small town for 30 years can be honest. "I hear what you are telling me," Bowen said, "and I believe you believe it. But what you have described to me is photographs of an empty room and veterinary records that a defense attorney will argue could belong to any number of sick animals from any number of sources. Without physical evidence, without a witness, without the animals themselves, I cannot get a warrant. That is not my opinion. That is the law." Corbett waited, but Bowen continued, and his voice carried the weight of a man choosing his next words with the care of someone who knows they will have to live with them for a long time. "If you find that boy, and if the dog he took with him shows the same injuries your veterinarian documented on the puppies, that is a living witness and physical evidence in one package. Bring me that, and I will have enough for a judge." The call ended. Corbett folded the map and placed it inside his jacket. Lena gathered her medical kit. Titan was already at the door before either of them moved toward it, his small body vibrating with the focused energy of a dog that had been waiting for this moment since the first rumble of thunder shook the cabin walls. Ghost stirred in his blanket, lifted his head, and watched his brother with the quiet, knowing gaze of an animal that understood something important was about to happen, even if his body was too weak to participate fully. Corbett lifted Ghost carefully and placed him on the passenger seat of the truck beside Titan. Both dogs would come. Titan because his instincts had already proven sharper than any map. Ghost because Corbett could not leave him alone in an empty cabin during a storm, and because some part of him, a part he could not fully explain, believed that the smallest and weakest member of this unlikely group deserved to be present when his family was found. They drove into the storm. The logging road dissolved beneath the truck's tires within the first mile. What had been a gravel surface that morning was now a river of brown water flowing steadily downhill between the tree trunks on both sides, carrying loose stones and broken branches in a current strong enough to push against the truck's wheels when Corbett guided it through the deeper sections. The headlights illuminated a tunnel of falling rain and bending trees that seemed to close tighter around the vehicle with every curve in the road, and the windshield wipers worked at their highest speed without fully clearing the glass. Corbett parked where the logging road ended and the forest trail began. From here, they would move on foot. The rain hit them immediately. Cold, heavy, relentless, soaking through their jackets within the first minute, and turning the ground beneath their boots into a surface that shifted and slid with every step. Lena carried her medical bag strapped across her chest to keep her hands free. Corbett carried a flashlight and the rope he kept behind the truck seat, a 200-foot length of climbing-grade cord that he had never expected to use for anything other than securing loads. Titan moved ahead of them both. The puppy's behavior changed the moment his paws touched the forest floor. The playful curiosity that had characterized his movements inside the cabin vanished, replaced by something older and deeper, a working intensity that straightened his spine and sharpened his focus until the small dog moved through the underbrush like a creature 10 times his age. His nose swept the ground in rapid, methodical arcs, testing the air between the raindrops, cataloging scents that no human nose could detect. And then, approximately 200 yards into the forest, Titan stopped. His entire body locked into position, ears forward, tail rigid, nose pointed toward the northeast, away from the main trail into a section of forest that climbed steeply toward a ridge Corbett recognized from his map as the area where old hunting cabins had once been built during elk season decades ago. A low, urgent whine escaped from Titan's throat, not a sound of fear, but of recognition. Something in the air ahead carried a scent the puppy knew, something that connected to the deepest part of his memory, older than the oak tree, older than the rain reaching back to the first warmth he had ever known. Corbett trusted it completely. They followed Titan up the slope, climbing through mud that grabbed at their boots and vegetation that whipped against their arms and faces in the wind. The roar of a swollen creek grew louder as they ascended its water, already spilling beyond the banks, somewhere below the ridge, and cutting through the valley floor in a rushing channel that would make any return by the lower trail impossible within the hour. Lightning split the sky and illuminated the forest in a single white flash that lasted just long enough for Corbett to see the outline of a structure ahead. A small cabin built from rough pine logs leaning to one side beneath years of snow and weather, its single window dark, its door hanging slightly open. They reached it in the next flash of lightning. Corbett pushed the door inward. The interior was cramped and cold, but dry enough that the air inside felt different from the forest immediately. A battered lantern sat on a shelf. A small cot had been pushed against the far wall. A stack of blankets had been arranged, recently not abandoned, and beside the cot a pair of muddy sneakers too small for an adult sat neatly side by side, as though someone had taken them off carefully despite being exhausted. On the far side of the room, huddled against the wall with a blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders, sat a boy. He was younger than the photograph on the clinic flyer had suggested, 12 years old perhaps, but the kind of 12 that arrives too early in children who have been required to take care of themselves longer than any child should. His dark hair hung damp against his forehead. His face was flushed with fever, and his body trembled with the deep, involuntary shaking that comes not from being cold for an hour, but from being cold for weeks, while the body slowly loses its ability to generate enough heat to sustain itself. His name was Eli Thorne, and the most striking detail in the room was not the boy himself, but the animal he held tightly against his chest. A German shepherd. A mother dog, large enough that her body covered most of the boy's lap. Her frame heavy with the powerful bone structure of a working-line shepherd, bred for strength and endurance. But her body was diminished. Her coat was matted in places, her ribs visible through the fur along her sides, and a deep gash ran along her right hind leg where dried blood had stiffened the hair into dark, crusted patches. Even in her weakened state, the dog lifted her head when the door opened and her amber eyes fixed on Corbett and Lena with the quiet, fierce vigilance of a mother who had been through too much to be startled by anything but who would not stop watching, would not stop guarding until whatever threatened her children had been identified and either accepted or destroyed. Titan broke free from Corbett's side and rushed forward. The puppy's entire body changed as he crossed the floor. The working intensity dissolved into something raw and uncontrolled, a desperate scrambling rush toward the mother dog that carried every ounce of recognition and relief and longing that a young animal's body could contain. He pressed his face against the mother's neck, whimpering in rapid, high-pitched bursts, and the mother dog lowered her great head slowly and licked the puppy's face with a tenderness so careful and so deliberate that it stopped Lena in her tracks near the doorway. Ghost stirred in Corbett's arms. The smaller puppy lifted his head for the first time in hours, and something in the scent that reached him through the cold air of the cabin caused his entire body to tremble with a vibration that had nothing to do with the cold. Corbett set him down gently, and Ghost moved across the floor with more strength than he had shown since the night of the rescue, reaching his mother and pressing himself against her chest where the sound of her heartbeat had once been the entire world. Eli watched the reunion with eyes that glistened in the dim light of the cabin. "You found them," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, scraped thin by fever and weeks of exposure, but underneath the exhaustion was something that sounded like the first breath drawn by a person who has been holding the weight of an impossible secret for so long that they had begun to believe no one would ever come to share it. "I left them by the road because they were the weakest ones." Eli continued, his arms still wrapped around the mother dog, his thin fingers buried in her matted fur. "I thought someone driving through at night might see them before the men came back." The third set of paw prints. The answer arrived in Corbett's mind with the clean, undeniable clarity of a truth that had been waiting patiently since the beginning to be understood. Shadow the mother had carried her two weakest puppies through the forest to the roadside oak tree, the place closest to passing traffic where they might be seen. She had placed them there. She had lingered long enough to leave her prints in the mud beside theirs. And then she had turned back into the darkness and returned to the boy who had freed her from the cages. Because a mother does not abandon her rescuer any more than she abandons her young. 3 tracks, 2 puppies, one mother who chose to divide herself between the children she had borne and the child who had saved her. Lena knelt beside Eli, immediately checking the fever that burned through his skin. Corbett examined the mother dog, whose breathing was shallow but steady, her injured leg swollen beneath the dried blood. The gash was deep enough to require surgical attention, but the bleeding had stopped days ago, and the dog's refusal to surrender suggested a constitution that matched the stubborn resilience of the boy who held her. "We need to move," Corbett said. "The lower trail is already flooded. We go by the ridge." The journey out of the forest became the longest hour of Corbett's life. He lifted Eli onto his back the way he had once carried wounded operators through terrain that tried to kill them with every step. The boy weighed almost nothing, his thin arms locked around Corbett's neck, his fevered forehead pressed against the back of Corbett's shoulder. Lena wrapped the mother dog in the wool blanket and carried her against her chest, the animal's injured leg immobilized against her body, the dog's amber eyes still open and watching the darkness over Lena's shoulder. The ridge path was narrow and steep and slick with mud that gave way beneath their boots in sudden treacherous slides. Rain poured down through the canopy in unbroken streams. Wind bent the trees around them until the forest itself seemed to be trying to push them back. And then the flashback came. Not the village this time, not the dogs behind the fence. The extraction. The night in the mountains south of Kandahar when everything went wrong at once. Corbett was carrying a wounded teammate along a goat path above a river valley, and the weight on his back was almost exactly the same as the weight he carried now. The rain was different. The mountains were different. But the feeling was identical. The burning in his legs. The desperate calculation of distance against time. The knowledge that if he stopped moving, the person depending on him would not survive to see morning. On that night, he had not been fast enough. The teammate had died 40 minutes before the helicopter arrived. 40 minutes that Corbett had spent sitting in the mud beside a body that was still warm, holding a hand that could no longer hold back, while the rain washed the blood from both of them in thin red streams that disappeared into the earth. He had carried that 40 minutes inside his chest for 6 years, like a stone that grew heavier with each season. But Eli's breathing was on his neck. Warm, alive, present. And from somewhere ahead on the trail, Titan barked once, sharp and clear through the storm. The sound cutting through the rain and the memory and the darkness, with the authority of a small creature that had decided the past did not get to win tonight. Corbett kept walking. The creek crossing was the worst of it. The water had risen to chest height in the hours since the storm began, flowing fast enough to pull a grown man off his feet if he stood in the wrong position for even a second. Corbett secured the rope around a thick cedar trunk on the near bank, tested the knot twice, the way years of training had taught him, then waded into the current with Eli still on his back and pulled himself across hand over hand while the water tried to tear them loose with every step. Lena followed with the mother dog held above the waterline, her face white with effort, her boots slipping on the submerged stones. Halfway across, Ghost lost his footing on a rock, and the current seized him instantly, pulling the small puppy downstream in a spinning tumble of fur and water. Titan lunged without hesitation, plunging into the deeper water and closing his jaws around the scruff of his brother's neck with a grip that held against the full force of the creek. For 3 seconds, that lasted longer than any 3 seconds, should the two puppies hung in the current together. Titan's legs churning against the water, Ghost dangling from his brother's mouth like a rag doll, until Corbett reached down with one arm and pulled them both onto the rope line. They reached the truck. Corbett set Eli onto the passenger seat. Lena placed the mother dog in the rear. Titan and Ghost collapsed together on the floorboard, soaked and exhausted and alive. The engine started on the first try, and the headlights cut through the rain toward the road that led back to Pine Hollow. In the rearview mirror, the forest disappeared behind a wall of water and darkness. And ahead, the lights of the town glowed faintly through the storm, like a promise that the night was not yet finished keeping. Eli's fever was climbing. The mother dog's breathing had grown shallower during the crossing, and somewhere behind them in the forest, Dwight Thorne was still operating in the dark, unaware that the evidence he had spent days destroying was now riding in the back of a truck driven by a man who had learned on this night of all nights that the missions worth completing were never the ones you could finish alone. Lena pressed her hand gently against the mother dog's chest and felt the heartbeat there, faint but stubborn, still pushing blood through a body that had every reason to quit and had chosen not to. "She is going to need surgery tonight," Lena said. "If we wait until morning, we lose her." Corbett drove faster. The rain continued to fall. And the long night was not over yet. The clinic lights were the only ones still burning on Main Street when Corbett's truck pulled into the parking lot. The rest of Pine Hollow had surrendered to the storm hours ago, its windows dark, its streets flooded with shallow rivers of brown water that flowed steadily toward the drainage ditches at the edge of town. But inside the Fort Pine Animal Rescue Clinic, every light was on, and Lena Hargrove was already moving before the engine stopped her boots hitting the wet pavement as she came around the truck and lifted the mother dog from the back seat with the controlled urgency of a woman who understood exactly how narrow the margin had become. Shadow weighed more than she looked. The dog's powerful frame, even diminished by weeks of neglect and injury, still carried the heavy bone structure of a working-line shepherd, and Lena adjusted her grip twice before carrying her through the clinic door and placing her on the surgical table beneath the overhead light. The dog's amber eyes remained open throughout, watching, measuring. Even now, even with her hind legs swollen and her breathing shallow and her body trembling from blood loss and cold, the mother dog tracked every movement in the room with the steady vigilance of an animal that had not yet decided whether this new place was safe. Corbett carried Eli inside and set him on the examination cot near the front counter. The boy's fever had climbed during the drive, his skin radiating heat through the wet blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and his dark eyes moved between Shadow on the surgical table and the two puppies that had followed Corbett through the door, and now stood side by side on the clinic floor, watching their mother with the silent intensity of creatures who understood that something important was being decided in this room. Lena worked quickly. She shaved the fur around Shadow's wound, cleaned the gash with saline, and assessed the damage. The laceration was deep but clean, running along the outer muscle of the hind leg without penetrating the joint. "She has been walking on this for at least 2 weeks," Lena said without looking up. "The infection has not reached the bone yet, but another day, and it would have. She would have lost the leg." The surgery took nearly 2 hours. Corbett sat with Eli during most of it, the boy drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, while Corbett applied cold compresses to his forehead and kept the blankets tight around his thin frame. At one point, Eli opened his eyes and looked directly at Corbett with the particular clarity that sometimes appears in children when fever strips away the protective layers they have learned to maintain around adults. "I could not leave them in the cages," Eli said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I found the building in September. I was following tracks in the forest and I heard them crying. When I looked inside, there were maybe 20 puppies. Some could barely stand." He paused. "I started letting the weakest ones out at night. I carried them to the oak tree because it is the closest spot to the road where cars pass. I could not take them all, so I took the ones that were not going to survive another week." Titan had climbed onto the cot and pressed himself against Eli's side, and the boy's hand moved automatically to the puppy's back. Shadow was the mother of most of them. She would not leave without her puppies. The last night when Dwight's truck showed up while I was inside, Shadow knocked me down and stood over me until the headlights passed. Then she followed me into the forest and has not left my side since. The boy's eyes closed. Sleep took him again, sudden and complete. Corbett remained beside the cot for a long time after that, listening to the sounds of Lena working on Shadow in the next room, the quiet clink of surgical instruments, the beep of the heart monitor, the soft murmuring voice she used to keep frightened animals calm during procedures. Titan lay with his head on Eli's chest, rising and falling with the boy's breathing. Ghost had positioned himself on the floor directly beneath the cot, curled into a tight circle, as though guarding the boy from below, while his brother guarded from above. Shortly before dawn, Lena emerged from surgery. Her jacket was spotted with blood, and her face showed the deep fatigue of someone who had been operating on sustained focus for hours without pause. But her expression carried something that had not been there when the night began. A quiet, steady relief that softened the lines around her eyes. "She made it," Lena said. "The leg is going to heal. She is going to need weeks of rest and careful management, but the infection is cleaned out and the sutures are holding. She is strong." Whatever kept her going through those weeks in the forest with that boy did not stop working on the table. Corbett exhaled a breath he had not realized he had been holding since carrying the dog through the clinic door. Morning arrived with the slow, exhausted beauty of a world that has survived something violent and is not yet certain it is over. The storm clouds drifted eastward over the Cascade foothills, trailing pale ribbons of mist behind them, and Pine Hollow emerged beneath a wash of early sunlight that made the wet rooftops and flooded streets look as though they had been painted in watercolor by a hand that was still trembling. The air smelled of clean rain and cedar and the deep mineral scent of earth that has been turned inside out by water and is slowly beginning to settle back into itself. Sheriff Bowen arrived at the clinic just after 7. He came in a county truck followed by a darker sedan bearing the insignia of the Oregon State Police. From the sedan stepped Detective Prewitt, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and dark hair cut short in a practical style. She carried the attentive stillness of someone accustomed to examining difficult situations without allowing emotion to cloud the precision her work required. Eli told his story again. Slowly, clearly sitting upright on the cot with Titan beside him, and Shadow resting in the recovery room behind the glass partition where the boy could see her. His voice was stronger now, the fever having broken some time before dawn, and he spoke with the careful, measured honesty of a child who understood that what he was saying carried weight, and who wanted every word to be exactly true. Lena presented her veterinary records. 4 months of documented cases. Missing litters mapped in a pattern radiating from the sawmill property. Medical findings from Ghost and Titan showing wire mesh abrasion and respiratory damage. Photographs of Shadow's surgical wound. And Corbett's phone containing images of the shack interior taken before Dwight's cleanup showing cages, scratched floors, and charred shipping manifests with visible route numbers. Detective Prewitt studied the evidence for nearly 20 minutes. Then she made 2 phone calls. The first to a county judge. The second to a field office handling interstate animal trafficking. By mid-afternoon, a warrant had been issued. Sheriff Bowen led the team to the sawmill property, where Dwight Thorne and 2 associates were found loading dismantled cage equipment onto a flatbed truck. They had been working through the storm, their clothing soaked and their vehicle mired in mud, attempting to remove the final evidence before it could be connected to the empty shack. Dwight saw the sheriff's vehicles, and his face held an expression Corbett would remember for a long time. Not fear. Something closer to the look of a man who has been playing a game with great confidence and has suddenly realized the board has more pieces than he accounted for. The arrests were quiet. The associates offered no resistance. Dwight spoke once to his lawyer on a cell phone before the handcuffs closed around his wrists. But the confrontation that mattered did not happen at the sawmill. It happened at Corbett's cabin, where he stood on the porch watching the sheriff's truck with Dwight in the back seat. The man's face was visible through the rain-spotted window flat and controlled, already calculating his next move. Even in handcuffs, Dwight carried the self-possession of a man who believed systems existed to be worked. For a single moment, Corbett felt the old instinct rise. the trained reflex of a man who had spent 12 years solving problems through direct physical action. He could see how it would go. The walk across the yard, the satisfaction of handling a threat with finality, but he did not move. He stood on the porch and let the moment pass through him the way the storm had passed through the valley. Powerful and present, but not permanent, not defining. I spent 2 years believing doing things alone was the only way to get them done right, Corbett said quietly to no one in particular. I was wrong. He looked at Lena with blood on her jacket and exhaustion in her eyes, at Eli on the cabin steps with Titan in his lap, at the forest standing quiet in the morning light. And he stepped inside, leaving the law to do the work he had learned to trust it to do. The days that followed moved at a different speed. The urgent, compressed rhythm that had driven every hour since the night beneath the oak tree gradually loosened and slowed until time in Pine Hollow began to feel like time again, marked not by crises and discoveries, but by the ordinary, unhurried accumulation of mornings and meals and the small tasks that fill a life when a life is being lived rather than merely survived. Shadow recovered. The process was slow and careful, managed by Lena's daily visits to the cabin where the mother dog rested on a thick folded blanket beside the heater vent. The wound on her hind leg closed cleanly over the first week, the sutures holding firm beneath the bandage that Lena changed every morning with the quiet, competent tenderness that characterized everything she did. Shadow's appetite returned before her strength did, and Corbett found himself cooking rice and chicken in quantities he had never prepared for himself. Setting the bowl on the floor beside the blanket where the great sable shepherd ate with the measured dignity of an animal that was choosing to trust the world again, one meal at a time. The moment that confirmed the healing had truly begun was not dramatic. It happened on a Tuesday morning 6 days after the surgery, when Shadow rose from her blanket on her own for the first time and walked slowly across the cabin floor to the open front door where sunlight was falling across the porch boards in long, warm rectangles. She stood in the doorway for nearly a minute, her amber eyes scanning the yard and the tree line beyond it with the quiet watchfulness that would never fully leave her. And then she lowered herself carefully onto the sun-warmed wood and rested her chin on her front paws and closed her eyes. Titan and Ghost found her there. The two puppies had been wrestling near the fence when the sound of their mother moving through the cabin brought them both to a sudden halt. They crossed the yard in a scrambling rush and pressed themselves against her sides, and Shadow lowered her great head and licked each of them in turn with the slow, deliberate care of a mother confirming that her children were still whole. Sheriff Bowen brought Eli home to Agnes on a Thursday evening when the sky above Pine Hollow was clear for the first time in weeks, and the last of the storm water had finally drained from the roads. The farmhouse looked different in the late afternoon light. The old apple trees cast long shadows across the yard, and the front porch, which had seemed so small and burdened on the morning Corbett had watched Dwight standing there, now appeared merely modest and well-worn and welcoming in the way that old porches become when they have witnessed enough years of comings and goings to understand that the only arrivals that truly matter are the ones you have stopped expecting. Agnes stood at the top of the steps. She had dressed carefully the way women of her generation dress when something important is about to happen. A clean blouse beneath her brown shawl, her silver hair gathered neatly at the back of her head, her pale blue eyes fixed on the county truck as it rolled slowly up the gravel drive. When Eli stepped out of the vehicle, Agnes did not speak. She placed both hands on the porch railing and watched the boy walk toward her across the yard with the same thin frame and the same serious brown eyes, and the same unhurried way of moving that she remembered from every morning he had ever walked down those steps toward the school bus stop at the end of the gravel drive. Eli climbed the steps, and Agnes pulled him into her arms and held him there. Neither of them said a word. The silence between them contained everything that words would have diminished. The months of separation, the fear, the prayers spoken alone in a dark kitchen, the courage of a boy who chose to protect the helpless, even when no one was watching. The endurance of a woman who refused to sell her home because some part of her believed that if she kept the door open, the person she loved most would eventually walk back through it. They stood like that on the porch, while the evening light moved slowly across the yard, and the shadows of the apple trees lengthened toward the road. In the weeks that followed, the town of Pine Hollow did what small towns do when the truth about one of their own finally reaches the surface. The story spread through the grocery store and the gas station and the church on Main Street, passed from one conversation to the next, with the particular energy that accompanies a narrative people had suspected but had been afraid to believe. The boy they had thought was a troubled runaway was something else entirely. The quiet child who disappeared into the forest had been waging a private war against cruelty that most adults in the valley had been too comfortable or too cautious to confront. The way people spoke about Eli changed, not overnight, but steadily, the way a river changes course when enough water pushes against a bank for long enough. Neighbors who had once shaken their heads about the troubled thorn boy began stopping Agnes at the post office to ask how Eli was adjusting to being home and how his schoolwork was coming along. The owner of the hardware store on Main Street donated lumber to fix the sagging corner of Agnes's porch without being asked or thanked. The community that had once known the Thorne family only through rumor now saw something in them that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. Corbett's life changed in ways he had not anticipated and could not have planned. The cabin that had once felt like a container for emptiness became something else. Titan grew rapidly through the weeks that followed the rescue, his puppy awkwardness giving way to the lean, athletic frame of a young working shepherd whose instincts sharpened daily. Corbett began training him using the books he had purchased years ago and never opened, and the process of teaching the dog became unexpectedly the process of teaching himself. Patience, consistency, the willingness to show up every morning and repeat the same small actions until they became something larger than the sum of their parts. Ghost grew at his own pace, smaller and quieter than his brother, but no less present. The puppy, who had nearly died beneath the oak tree, developed into a gentle, watchful dog who stayed close to Corbett's side with the calm loyalty of an animal that had decided early in life where he belonged and saw no reason to reconsider. Where Titan was bold and forward and alert, Ghost was still and observant and steady, and together the two dogs filled the cabin with a balance that Corbett had not known was possible. Eli came to the cabin after school most afternoons. He helped Corbett feed the dogs and clean the yard and carry firewood from the shed to the porch. The boy did not talk much during these visits, and Corbett did not press him to. They worked side by side in the comfortable silence of two people who had survived something together and did not need to discuss it in order to feel its presence between them. Occasionally, Eli would ask a question about the military, and Corbett would answer honestly, and sometimes the answers were about things Corbett had never told anyone else, because there had never been anyone who would have understood why they mattered. Agnes came on Sundays with soup and bread. Lena stopped by twice a week to check on Shadow, whose recovery continued with the quiet stubbornness that characterized everything about the dog. The wound healed, the limp diminished. And one morning, Corbett looked out the kitchen window, and saw Shadow standing in the yard with her head raised toward the tree line and her ears forward, watching the forest, not with fear, but with the calm proprietary attention of an animal that had decided this territory was hers, and she intended to keep it. On a clear morning several weeks after the storm, Corbett sat on the porch of his cabin with a cup of coffee balanced on the railing beside him. Titan lay at his feet, chin resting on his paws, ears twitching at the sounds of birds moving through the branches overhead. Ghost was curled on the porch chair behind him, sleeping in a patch of sunlight. Shadow stood in the yard near the fence, watching Eli throw a stick across the grass, while Agnes sat on an old bench near the apple tree, talking quietly with Lena about something that made both women smile. The valley stretched out below the cabin in the morning light, the forest bright with early sun, and the air carrying the clean scent of rain that had washed the world and moved on. Somewhere in the distance, a truck moved along the timber highway, and the sound of its engine drifted through the hills like the heartbeat of a town that was slowly beginning to understand itself better than it had before. Corbett watched the scene in the yard for a long time. He thought about the night beneath the oak tree, the two puppies in the rain, the choice he had made to stop rather than drive past. He thought about how small that decision had seemed in the moment and how far its consequences had traveled, reaching into the forest and the courtroom and the old farmhouse down the road and the deep interior of his own chest where the stone he had carried for 6 years had not disappeared, but had grown lighter as though the weight of it was being shared now by the people and animals that filled the spaces around him. Agnes had said something to him the previous Sunday while they sat together in the kitchen after the others had gone. Her voice had been quiet, almost offhand, the way people speak when they are saying something they have thought about for a very long time and want it to sound simple rather than heavy. Sometimes God does not send miracles as thunder or light from the sky, she said, looking out the window at the trees. Sometimes he sends two puppies shivering in the rain and waits to see whose heart is still open enough to stop. Corbett had not answered. He was not a man who spoke easily about faith or about the forces that move beneath the surface of ordinary life. But he had understood what she meant, and the understanding had settled into him with the quiet permanence of something that would remain long after the words themselves faded. He looked at Titan sleeping at his feet. He looked at Ghost in the sunlight behind him. He looked at Eli laughing in the yard with a stick in his hand and a dog at his side, and the serious brown eyes that were finally, slowly beginning to look like the eyes of a 12-year-old boy instead of someone much older. For the first time in 2 years, Corbett Hale did not want to drive anywhere. He did not want motion without destination or the steady hum of tires on wet pavement to keep the memories from rising. He did not want the silence of the cabin to mean what it had meant before those two small lives appeared in his headlights on a rainy night. He wanted to sit on this porch, in this light, with these lives around him. He wanted to stay right here. And so he did.